Every headline about the British royal family tells you something, but it almost never tells you everything. The headline says Andrew arrested. It doesn't tell you what was happening inside Buckingham Palace in the hours before police arrived, or what the king said to his advisors when they brought him the news, or what it felt like to be Beatrice and Eugenie, Andrew's daughters, watching their father's name scroll across television chyrons on their morning news. The headline says Charles delivers King's speech. It doesn't tell you that on the very same day, the prime minister he was constitutionally required to work alongside was fighting for his political life inside a federal parliament that was rife with plots and rumors, while the king arrived in a horse-drawn carriage with military bands and his bodyguards' steel breastplates gleaming in the rain, performing the ancient ritual of constitutional theater with the steady composure of someone who has spent 70 years learning exactly how to hold himself above the noise. The headline says, Kate attends royal wedding. It doesn't tell you what it actually meant, after everything she has been through, to stand in a churchyard in June sunshine alongside her husband, a few weeks after her first solo overseas trip in 3.5 years, and simply be present at a family occasion as though presence were an ordinary, unremarkable thing, rather than the achievement it actually represents. Headlines compress the world into a phrase. The story behind them takes considerably longer. So let's take that time today and go properly behind the palace headlines of the past several months. Because what's actually been happening in and around the British monarchy lately is more human, more layered, and in some ways more genuinely remarkable than even the most dramatic of the headlines has quite managed to convey. Start with the state opening of Parliament on the 13th of May, because it's one of those events that looks, from the outside, like the purest possible expression of royal theater, all pomp and ceremony and historical costume, and where the reality underneath turns out to be considerably more interesting and considerably more telling than the spectacle itself. King Charles III arrived at Westminster in a horse-drawn coach, flanked by 100-strong guard of honor, military bands playing, mounted lifeguardsmen resplendent in ceremonial armor, the airspace above London restricted for the occasion. In the cellars beneath Parliament, his scarlet-clad yeoman warders reenacted the gunpowder plot search in a piece of historical theater that dates back to Guy Fawkes's failed attempt to blow the building up in 1605. A member of Parliament was formally held hostage at Buckingham Palace, as tradition demands, to ensure the monarch's safe return, a ritual that dates back to the reign of the original King Charles, who stormed Parliament in 1642 to arrest lawmakers for treason, sparked a civil war, and was eventually beheaded. And in the middle of all this layered, centuries-deep constitutional theater, the king stood in the House of Lords and delivered a speech written entirely by the government of the day, word for word, without expressing a single personal opinion about any of it, because that is precisely constitutionally what is required of him. But here's what was happening on the same day in the same city, just a few hundred yards from Parliament. Prime Minister Keir Starmer was fighting what many commentators considered a potentially terminal political crisis. More than 80 Labour lawmakers had called for him to resign, dismayed by 2 years of policy errors and reversals and a catastrophic showing in recent local elections that had the feel of a party losing its confidence in its own leadership. Starmer had dared his internal opponents to find the numbers to challenge him and let him get on with his job. And his main rival, Health Secretary Wes Streeting, had arrived at Downing Street for what was billed as a decisive showdown, only to leave again 17 minutes later without having openly declared a challenge. The political drama was real, and it was intense, and it was happening in the same moment, in the same buildings, as the king processed through Parliament in his coach and read his government's legislative program as though the political weather around him were entirely calm. That's what the cameras showed. What they couldn't show was what it actually takes in terms of discipline and training and sheer personal composure to perform the monarchy's constitutional role with that degree of steady, visible equanimity on a day when the government you are constitutionally required to work with is simultaneously unraveling around you. Robert Hardman, who has covered Charles more closely than almost any other journalist over many years, has described the king as someone who is, in his assessment, genuinely on a roll in this period of his reign, delivering the kind of steady, purposeful public presence that the institution needs regardless of whatever personal or political turbulence surrounds it. That assessment was nowhere more visible than on the 13th of May, when Charles stepped out of his coach and walked into a constitutionally febrile parliament, as though it were the most natural, most manageable thing in the world. Now let's go back slightly further to the headline that everyone saw, but that almost nobody reported in its full human context. Andrew has moved out of Royal Lodge. 4 words that, when you look at them in isolation, sound like a neat administrative resolution to a messy situation. But the story behind those 4 words is considerably more complicated and considerably more humanly difficult than they suggest. Andrew Mountbatten Windsor had been living at Royal Lodge, a 30-room mansion set in Windsor Great Park, for more than 2 decades. He had reportedly paid £1 million for the lease in the early 2000s and had since been paying, in a detail that generated its own wave of public outrage when it emerged, a peppercorn rent for a property whose maintenance costs ran into the tens of millions. The eviction process, once the king had initiated it, was not swift. Andrew had legal protections from his lease that meant simply telling him to go was not constitutionally or legally straightforward, and the process of serving formal notice and awaiting his actual departure stretched over months, during which time the public narrative fluctuated between concern that Charles was going soft on his brother and frustration at the apparent difficulty of simply removing one man from one house. When Andrew finally moved, it was to what was described as an old farm in the Sandringham area in Norfolk, a considerably more modest arrangement than the 30-room mansion he had been occupying, and one that underlined, perhaps more starkly than any formal announcement could have, exactly how complete and how irreversible his fall from the center of royal life had become. And what of his daughters? Because Beatrice and Eugenie are one of the more quietly significant human stories running through all of this, and they've been almost entirely absent from the headlines, despite navigating something that would be genuinely devastating for any family. Their father has been arrested. Their father's name has appeared in millions of pages of documents released by the American justice system, alongside details and photographs that have been discussed and dissected in newsrooms around the world. Their father has been stripped of the title he was born with, evicted from the home they grew up visiting, and is living in reduced circumstances on a Norfolk farm while a criminal investigation into his conduct continues. And they have done all of this while trying to maintain their own lives, their own marriages, their own public-facing involvement in a family institution that their father's conduct has put under extraordinary strain. The June wedding of their cousin Peter Phillips and his new bride Harriet Spurling at All Saints Church in Kemble, Gloucestershire, was the occasion that gave royal watchers the clearest recent public glimpse of both sisters attempting to do exactly that, to show up for family in the middle of family catastrophe. They attended. They were photographed. They smiled. The photographs circulated with the commentary that their presence showed the family pulling together, which is true, but which tells only part of a story that also includes the separate private detail that both sisters have reportedly been struggling significantly with their father's situation and have had to make difficult decisions about how to maintain their own relationship with him while also maintaining their standing within an institution that has definitively and publicly closed the door on any future role for Andrew within it. The Peter Phillips wedding itself was a quietly significant moment in other ways too, because it brought together a slice of the extended royal family that has rarely been photographed together in recent years, and the guest list told its own story about the current shape of the Windsor family and which relationships are currently functional, which are strained, and which have effectively ended. William and Kate were there, which was itself notable given Kate's still careful approach to her social and official schedule in her first full year of post-remission life. Their presence at a private family occasion, rather than an official public engagement, was a choice rather than an obligation, and it spoke to the genuine family affection that underlies the institutional relationships between the cousins. Harry and Meghan were not there, which surprised nobody given how far the Sussexes have drifted from not just the working royal family, but from the extended family social occasions that were once a regular feature of Harry's life. Princess Anne's son was the groom, which meant Anne herself was central to the occasion, in a way that highlighted something that royal commentators have noted with increasing frequency, which is that Anne has become, in the reduced and complicated landscape of the current working royal family, an even more indispensable presence than she was before. Her decades of loyal, consistent, entirely uncontroversial public service, providing a kind of institutional ballast that the family needs more urgently than ever. Behind the wedding photographs, there was another story worth telling, which concerns the remarkable and genuinely touching detail that was reported from the ceremony itself. According to multiple accounts, the bride's bouquet contained a hidden message, a small personal element that only those who knew what to look for would have noticed, the kind of intimate human touch that gets entirely lost in the official photographs, but that says something real about the people involved, that they chose, on one of the most photographed days of their lives, to include something private and personal that was just for them and for the people they love, rather than for the cameras. That detail, reported by royal correspondents who caught it, is not important in any institutional or constitutional sense. But it's a useful reminder that behind every royal headline are actual human beings, making actual personal choices on actual days that matter to them in ways that have nothing to do with institution or symbolism or the endless, scrutinizing gaze of public attention. Now let's talk about the headline that said Charles visits Ireland and what was actually happening beneath it, because this particular story has layers that the headlines barely scratched. King Charles confirmed a state visit to Ireland, which is historically significant in ways that require some context to fully appreciate. The relationship between Britain and Ireland has been shaped by centuries of colonial history, conflict, political violence, and extraordinarily difficult process of reconciliation that is still, in some respects, ongoing. State visits between the two countries carry a weight of history that almost no other bilateral relationship in the world carries in quite the same way, and the fact that Charles has pursued this relationship actively as part of what commentators have described as a genuine personal commitment to British-Irish reconciliation that goes back decades is one of the less celebrated but genuinely meaningful aspects of his reign. His historic 2011 state visit to Ireland as Prince of Wales, at a time when such a visit was still far from routine or uncontroversial, is widely credited with having contributed meaningfully to the warming of relations between the two countries. His decision to continue developing that relationship as king, including the latest state visit announcement, represents a continuity of diplomatic and personal purpose that is characteristically Charles, and that exists somewhat apart from the more dramatic headlines that have dominated his reign's coverage. The Irish visit also connects to something broader about how Charles has been operating as king during this extraordinarily difficult period, something that the steady drumbeat of crisis coverage has sometimes obscured. He has been doing the actual constitutional work of kingship, the diplomatic relationships, the state visits, the receptions, the formal functions that underpin Britain's international relationships, with a consistency and a seriousness of purpose that has been noted and appreciated by the governments he works with, even when it has been underreported by a media necessarily more interested in the dramatic headline of an arrest or a scandal than in the undramatic but genuinely important work of a monarch receiving foreign heads of state and maintaining the relationships that British soft power depends on. The Nigerian state visit, the first such visit between Britain and Nigeria since 1989, the meeting with the Irish president, the continued engagement with Commonwealth leaders, all of this has been happening simultaneously alongside the Andrew crisis, alongside the ongoing cancer treatment, alongside the Harry situation and the succession questions and the Andrew succession legislation discussions. The story behind the headline King Charles busy with diplomatic schedule is that a man in his mid-70s, undergoing active cancer treatment, surrounded by a family in extraordinary personal and institutional difficulty, is nevertheless showing up for the constitutional requirements of his role with a steadiness and a discipline that people who study the monarchy professionally find genuinely remarkable. And then there is the headline that appeared in various forms across several publications in recent weeks around the time of the Trooping the Color ceremony in June of this year. Something to the effect of Princess Charlotte steals the show, which is true in the sense that photographs of Charlotte, now 11 years old and possessed of what royal correspondents described admiringly as real poise and composure for her age, generated enormous public warmth and considerable social media attention. But the story behind that headline is more interesting than a charming 11-year-old attracting attention. It's the story of a family that has been through an exceptionally difficult period, dealing with cancer diagnoses and criminal scandals and family estrangements and public crises, choosing to show up at one of the monarchy's most visible, most photographed annual ceremonies, and doing it with the particular quality of genuine family warmth that cannot be manufactured by a communications team. The children, and especially Charlotte and Louis, whose unscripted moments at public events have become some of the most widely shared royal content of the past few years, provided in those Trooping the Color photographs something the institution genuinely needed, and that the public genuinely responded to, a reminder that underneath all the institutional drama, there is a real family with real children who are growing up and developing their own personalities and their own relationship with the extraordinary life they have been born into. Behind the balcony photographs, there is a detail that an insider shared with Hello magazine that is so quintessentially, unexpectedly human that it has stuck with everyone who heard it. The royals on that famous balcony cannot actually see the crowds they are waving at. The Queen Victoria Memorial standing in front of the palace blocks their view of the mall, where the majority of the royal fans are gathered. So the palace has installed small hidden televisions in the corners of the balcony, slightly angled, so that the family can actually see what they are waving at, can watch themselves on the screens as well as watch the crowd below. It's a detail so charmingly, wonderfully mundane that it feels almost fictional, and yet it's entirely real. And it perfectly captures something essential about the gap between how the monarchy looks from the outside and how it actually functions from within. From the outside, ancient, majestic, effortless. From the inside, a bit improvised, quietly practical, doing what needs doing with whatever's available, including, apparently, small hidden televisions on the balcony of Buckingham Palace. The story behind the palace headlines, when you go looking for it properly, is not the story of a grand, impervious institution floating serenely above the concerns of ordinary life. It's the story of real people navigating genuinely difficult circumstances, making decisions under extraordinary pressure, sometimes getting things badly wrong and sometimes getting them quietly, undramatically right, in ways that the headlines never quite capture because the headlines need drama and impact rather than nuance and context. It's the story of a king reading a government's legislative program in a horse-drawn coach on the same day the government is falling apart around him, with the steady composure of someone who knows that his job in that specific moment is to be the thing that doesn't fall apart. It's the story of a princess who spent a year in cancer treatment, quietly rebuilding her capacity to be present, to show up, to engage, and then traveling alone to a preschool in northern Italy and sitting on the floor with small children who had no idea who she was, because that's where the work she believes in actually happens. It's the story of two young women attending their cousin's wedding while their father faces criminal investigation because families are complicated and presence matters even when everything is impossibly difficult. And it's the story of a family, imperfect and complicated and genuinely human in all the ways that the carefully managed imagery of royal life tries very hard to suggest they are not, finding ways to keep going through one of the most genuinely challenging periods the institution has faced in living memory. Headlines tell you what happened. The story behind them tells you what it was actually like. And what it's actually been like recently in and around the British monarchy is something considerably more human, more complicated, and in the end more genuinely interesting than any single headline has quite managed to say.